So my name is Chaitanya. I work as the head of environment and green transition at the New Economics Foundation. We're a think tank and a charity based in London. Been working on the thing that we are most passionate about is, of course, the Green New Deal, something that NEF and a bunch of organizations, at least in the UK, started talking about back during or just after the recession in 2008 and 9. That idea sort of was simmering at the back and over the last few years, again, really picked up with a lot of attention from the States, but obviously also in the UK. And we've also got some fantastic youth groups with GND rising, Green New Deal rising, that is really sort of paving the way forward for the kind of campaigning and activism we want to see. So NEF is really keen on helping that movement think about policy, think about solutions to the climate crisis. Before I kick us off, just a couple of housekeeping things. If you haven't already, please do introduce yourself on the chat. The event is, of course, about Cop26 and what really went down there. And it's been, a couple of weeks already since the event ended. We have taken our time to avoid hot takes because there are a whole ton of hot takes that we saw post-COP, especially if you're on Twitter. We want to sort of take time to digest, reflect, and this session 2 weeks after the event is really sort of looking at obviously what happened, but also some of the speakers will speak about what comes next. How do we think about the future after COP? If you're tweeting about the event, please use the hashtag NEF briefing, NEF briefing during the event. Speakers will talk one after the other. At the end of each speaker, there'll be a very short Q&A that I'll lead, 1 or 2 questions perhaps. And right at the end, there'll be Q&A again from the audience. And I was hoping, if possible, to sort of kick us off with a polling question, but there's no poll as such. So I'm just going to ask the participants here on the call to perhaps just respond via chat to this question. How would you characterize the outcome of the COP26 negotiations? And I've got some options because obviously there's a whole set of views you can have, but 4 options that I've got. One is, as is often described, significant progress made, but highly inadequate, more empty words and hollow promises, historic success, historic failure, or none of the above. This is just a sense check on where people are at in terms of how they saw the outcome of COP26 negotiations. Significant progress, but highly inadequate, more empty words and hollow promises, a historic success, a historic failure, or none of the above. So I'll let participants, those on the call, just respond on chat. We'll reflect on that perhaps at the end of the call and see if the speakers perhaps swayed some of the opinions you had prior to this as well. So 2 quick points to intro before I pass it on to our first speaker, Nathan. Now, climate change is today's Ipsos Mori poll suggests that climate change is one of the biggest concerns for the British public. It tops Brexit, COVID, all of the issues combined. Unsurprisingly, given the media coverage we've seen on climate change in COP26, there's been a lot of concern that's building up and become a big issue. And we'd like to think that will be sustained leading up to the elections in a few years' time. But the coverage also means it comes with some pitfalls. That is, the coverage, as we know, put heavy emphasis on countries like, for example, India and China as the bad guys, the fall guys, for watering down the final deal. When the reality, of course, is far more nuanced. That is something our speakers will touch upon, I'm sure. Now, when we went into COP26, you'll remember, we were told the planet and our civilization was close to midnight, 2 minutes to midnight, and that this was the last hope for humanity. A hope that was, I suppose, rather sadly, dependent on a bunch of technocratic negotiators and political leaders that are seeking short-term political victories. That is why I found the speech by David Attenborough quite interesting and inspiring, as he focused on precisely that question of leadership, asking leaders to sort of step up and beyond their short-term political goals and really give that leadership that we needed. And that is what we look to from our political leaders. But the question is, did we get that at COP26? That is the question we'll discuss in the next hour. Did we see that genuine leadership from the rich nations? Did we make any progress? Does this COP at least set us in the right direction to save ourselves from climate catastrophe? I wish the answers were a simple yes and no, but they obviously aren't. And that is where our speakers come in. So without wasting more time, I just want to introduce very quickly our first speaker, Nathan Thanki. Nathan's been, I suppose I can say, a veteran of these negotiations. He's been to a fair few of these COPs, really understands the intricacies of these negotiations, the ins and outs of it, and he was, again, obviously at COP26 as well. Nathan, you've got about 4 to 6 minutes, after which I'll try and stop you. So the floor is yours. Just speak about your experience, what you think was the main highlights for people to take away from COP26.
Sure, thanks, Chaitanya. I will try and keep myself to 4 minutes. Obviously, just interrupt me if I go over. I'll also try and not speak too quickly. So yeah, I think, you know, it's useful to do these kinds of exercises and ask ourselves what's on balance the evaluation that we would have. I think a few observations from me. You know, this COP, it's the 26th one. You know, this is not the first rodeo. But what did it specifically reveal? There's a lot of things it revealed. I think about domestic politics in the UK, about the Conservative Party, about big green NGOs, about the relationship between those two and mainstream media, the revolving door. But I also think it reveals a significant challenge to their collective grip on narrative and on discourse. We may get into that in some of the Q&A or some of the other speakers. I think more deeply, though, it reveals that, you know, in this moment in time, the multilateralism that we have, so the actually existing multilateral system isn't functioning. It is not responding to the crises that we face, even less so in a pandemic world. The power imbalances in our world are so great, and the crises are so demanding that, you know, to be really frank, I think the multilateral system as we have it is insufficient. The only thing that would be sufficient is basically nothing short of global revolution. The UN system isn't going to achieve that. It's not going to negotiate that. That's not, you know, how you do a revolution, a negotiated outcome between states. But it will remain an important space. I'll try and emphasize why towards the end. But basically, to try and limit the damage that's being done, and to try and organize ourselves as the climate crisis really accelerates, and as it will in the coming years. So this COP, I think, was markedly different from previous COPs in just how much of a circus it has become. You know, it's 95% trade show, celebrity stage built around and overshadowing the remaining 5%, which is the actual technical negotiations, which is where, you know, you always find the devil in the detail. Plenty of devils in the details of COP26. The way the UK as the president ran it was remarkable, not in a good way. They came with their own agenda, very clear, and we had basically 2 years to organize around it. You probably remember and are familiar: coal, cars, cash, and canopies. So deforestation, climate finance, something about cars, and a mention of coal that they really wanted to secure, in addition to whatever else from the formal outcomes that they could. So, you know, they really did a good job from their point of view in setting up and painting themselves and the rest of the developed world as champions of 1.5, and the Glasgow summit as crucial to delivering a 1.5. And the media narrative in the aftermath of COP, I think, it plays that out. They had a lot of fanfare around bringing world leaders, and it was really left to us, the climate justice movements, to call bullshit on that. They had a strategy of inclusion that was to wreak chaos and havoc amongst the organized civil society. They cherry-picked and tokenized in order to legitimize themselves with their representation. All of this is optics, but these, like, we have to remember, are the masters of this game of spin and of divide and rule. They have had 800 years of practice. So when we evaluate our opposition to that and our ability to dent that, we have to do so in that context. This is really David and Goliath stuff. I would say that the outcome of COP is not one that was a good outcome that could have been better. So sort of answering the opening question, I think it's actually a very bad outcome that could have been even worse, principally because it codifies and enshrines a major shift in responsibility from the rich world to the poor, away from all of the principles, the provisions that the legal architecture on climate change at the international level has been founded on. This idea that we're all in the same storm, but we're not in the same boat. So we've talked about common and differentiated responsibilities. There's a major attempt culminating in Glasgow, I think, to erode that. It will continue, of course. On the major outcomes, I think you would say going into it, developing countries had like three main priorities around finance, around loss and damage, so dealing with the impacts, and around adapting to the impacts. And developed countries probably had, let's say three outcomes that they wanted as well. They wanted an outcome on markets. They wanted to finalize the rules of the Paris Agreement, some transparency rules, and they wanted some outcome on around 1.5 and around mitigation. So if we're assessing those just very briefly, on finance, the context is, of course, that there's an utter failure to deliver on previous commitments of 100 billion. Rich countries wanted to acknowledge this and welcome this failure. We managed to secure some small wins, but they're really procedural and really small, in that we will continue to talk about long-term finance. Rich countries wanted to stop talking about it. There's a mandate now to have a definition of climate finance, although rich countries succeeded in ensuring that it actually reads definitions, so there will be multiple. We will emerge in 2024 with a new goal on finance, a new long-term goal that is far in excess of 100 billion, because that's completely inadequate. 1.3 trillion a year was what was being thrown around by some developing countries, but when you look at other sources, the UN itself estimates that you need about 6 trillion a year by 2030 for developing countries, just to meet their mitigation commitments, so just to reduce their emissions. That's before we talk about loss and damage, which is the second big fight that developing countries wanted and tried to wage in Glasgow. Again, they had a small procedural win because they have a new network that now has gotten some money towards this network, and it has agreed its function. So big whoop, that's a nice technical win being spun into a more significant win than it really is by the UK. The real fight that it has always been about is money for dealing with the impacts themselves. So not some money to fund a consultant to tell you what to do, but actually money to cope when you're hit, and also to avert as much as possible the impacts that are raining down on you. What we got instead was a dialogue for another couple of years. But as the developing country said on the last day, their understanding of that dialogue is that at the end of it, it will lead to a finance facility. I really encourage you to read the Third World Network update on loss and damage fight, because it really shows the sheer callousness that our developed country negotiators have when it comes to this issue. They were punting it from pillar to post, saying, can't talk about loss and damage finance in the loss and damage agenda. We have to talk about it in the finance agenda. In the finance agenda, they said, we can't talk about it here either. It has to be a political issue. Let the ministers discuss it. So they just delayed and delayed. When a proposal did come from the developing world, they refused to even debate it on the floor. They just refused, and it wasn't included. Again, a small win in adaptation, but it's a 2-year work program, and they've tried to spin a doubling of adaptation finance as a significant win. Twice nothing is still nothing. Where the developed countries did get their successes is unfortunately a loss for climate. They've set up an international offsetting market. So this is just crazy. There is no carbon budget, nor indeed enough earth, enough forest, enough trees, enough ocean, enough landmass to provide these offsets. But we're going ahead with them. Complete chaos in the bilateral trading system. There's no limit on the amount of offsets you can use to achieve your Paris contribution, your NDC. That's only going to get reviewed in 2028. There's no money even generated from these offsets in the bilateral sphere for adaptation. There is a little bit, 5%, that will be generated under the Paris mechanism. That was a win for developing countries, but this is like chicken feed. These are really the scraps, and it's a poison chalice as well, because they are being essentially forced to agree to the market mechanisms and engage in these market mechanisms in order to achieve a little bit of finance, because they're not getting it from anywhere else. And then we get a work program on dealing with non-market. So I'll wrap up very, very briefly. The whole point and the whole fanfare is around keeping 1.5 alive. Alex Sharma's come out and said that Glasgow does that, but it keeps it on a kind of a lifeline. How have they actually done that? When you look at the decisions, what have they actually done? They've got some dialogues, they've got some roundtables, they've got some workshops. That's not keeping 1.5 alive. They've got distant 2050 net zero goals. That's unscientific. That's inequitable. As Bolivia said in the closing plenary, this is carbon colonialism at play. They're very selective on the science. Talk about referencing it all the time. What does the IPCC actually say in their 1.5 report? They say that for a 50% chance, so terrible chance, of remaining below 1.5, we've got 500 gigatons of CO2 left that we can emit. And we will burn through that in less than a decade. Developed countries have been responsible for 60% of emissions up to now. And they want to be responsible for the remainder as well. It's a real boxing people in. Chaitanya mentioned the reference to the coal phase out and phase down, a very selective focus on some of the language, which seeks to blame and seeks to pass all responsibility onto the developing world without any acknowledgement of the historical responsibility, and crucially, without any of the provision of the necessary finance. How are we going to do a just transition in this world that we have, when you've got billions of people without access to electricity? If you don't provide them with the resources to do that, they're not going to appear from nowhere. If you've also got massive debt, if you've also got that debt accruing even greater rates because you're having to divert your resources to dealing with climate impacts, to dealing with the pandemic, and to servicing the debt, it's only going to get worse. So a lot of the debates that emerge as a result are, I think, the necessary ones that we need to be having as a climate justice movement, because gone are the days where it's just, yeah, we just need to reduce our emissions and some net zero thing is going to achieve it. I think our wins in Glasgow were that we completely debunked that. And now we're having these conversations where we're saying, if not zero, if not net zero by 2050, then what? And how would we achieve that? So I'll leave it there because I'm sure I've gone over time. Sorry.
Cool. Thanks a lot, Nathan. I've got one question from Carol that is on chat. Where's it gone now? Sorry. Essentially, Carol's asking about lobbies. We know fossil fuel lobby was the largest delegation at the COP. How can that be allowed is what Carol's asking. Perhaps if you could speak to is the COP process itself, and is it very easy for that to happen? And B, from a moral standpoint, what does it say that when you're trying to tackle climate change, essentially giving access to those who are literally criminally killing the planet at the same time?
Yeah, well, I think unfortunately they hide behind disingenuously using an argument that you have, which we use as part of our, and the labor movement uses as part of the just transition argument. The people who are involved in some of these industries, of course, have to be involved in the transition and the managed decline of those industries. Probably not the CEOs, though. There I wouldn't consider them to be affected in a significant sense. But the reason that, of course, the lobbyists are able to join the UNFCCC is because there's no conflict of interest policy in place. Many of us have campaigned for a long time to have one established, to have something akin to the UN treaty on tobacco, where tobacco lobbyists aren't allowed to be part of setting policy on tobacco regulation. And we could do something similar in the UNFCCC, but that has been strongly resisted principally by developed countries. But you've also got, I think, a very considerable challenge in that you could do that and you could keep Shell out and you could keep, the BPs out, but you've got a number of state-owned interests as well. So it would be challenging to do that. I think that that's obviously a problem in how COPs are run. But yeah, we can talk about the procedures another time.
Cool. Thanks a lot, Nathan. Just aware of the time, please do put your questions in for Nathan in the chat. There will be time again at the end, and I'll try and raise them again. I want us to move on to our next speaker, Izzy Warren. Izzy works with, or volunteers with, I should say, UK Student Climate Network in London. Izzy is one of the amazing activists, young activists that has emerged onto the scene. We've been seeing a lot of youth activism over the last couple of years, and this narrative that a lot of the impacts of climate change, the fact that they're already here is clear, is evident. Look out the window, it's evident. But perhaps the business as usual approach and where we headed is obviously creating an environment that is inhospitable for a lot of younger people today. So a sense of moral authority that young people have adopted is very important in actually moving the negotiations and discussions forward. And in fact, if you look at some of the speeches, whether they're genuine or not, perhaps is a secondary issue, but we did see a lot of negotiators, a lot of heads of states also speak about young people, speak about their own kids and grandkids, and the reason why they're here, why they're trying to do something about this issue is for them. One would hope that they would be doing a lot more if that is indeed the motivation. But regardless, that's been a central plank, central motivation for these conversations and why we ought to act on climate change with deep urgency. So I'll pass it on to Izzy. You've got 4 to 6 minutes, Izzy, and then I'll follow it up with a couple of questions from the audience.
Cool. Yeah, so I am a young climate activist. I'm 17 years old, and I got involved in climate activism at the beginning of the school strike movement in the midst of Cop24. And it's really great to see that we're being listened to about as much now at post Cop26 as we were back then. I think, like most people on this call, I look at what happened in Glasgow and I'm filled with disappointment, but it's not surprising. And I think it's important to remember that we weren't expecting Glasgow to be the solution to all of the problems. We weren't expecting Glasgow to be this miracle. And I think climate activists at most points, or at least good climate activists at most points, recognize that we're not going to stop climate change, which is a crisis that has been caused by decades and centuries of exploitation, by colonialism and imperialism and racism and the patriarchy. We're not going to solve that in a system that replicates those exact same systems of oppression. And that is what COP and these international conferences is. Climate change is not going to ever be stopped by a bunch of world leaders and billionaires taking their private jets somewhere for 2 days to talk about how bad, how terrible everything that's happening is, and then leaving and not speaking about it again. But I think we tend to sort of forget that when we get caught up in the momentum around COP. And obviously it is important, it is significant, but it means that when something like this does happen and we don't get what we want out of it and we don't get the commitments at the scale that we need, it's extremely disheartening, and you get a lot of people burning out and sort of giving up and feeling like we failed as a movement. And we haven't failed as a movement, because our success is not dependent on what happens in these conferences, because if our movement is doing the right thing, then the people who are negotiating, the people who are speaking at COP, the people who hold the power at COP shouldn't agree with us. They shouldn't be wanting to do what we're doing. And I think it's important to recognize that that is not the end of this. I think the fact that COP26 was postponed for a year meant that the build up to it was even bigger, because we knew that COP26 was always going to be a significant COP. We knew that it was always going to be, we're running out of time. Every COP we have, it gets more and more important. So the lead up to this has been extremely important, and a lot of people have put a lot of work into it. But it means that now that it's happened, now that it's over and we haven't had the outcome that we were looking for, it can feel disheartening. It can feel like, where do we go from here next? And we keep doing what we've been doing, because stuff is changing, but we don't let up the pressure now. We don't sit back now. We don't give up now. Now is the point that we double down. Now is the point that we keep calling out what we're hearing from these politicians. And a lot of what we're getting from them is just hypocrisy. And we see politicians, like you were saying, who are talking about their children and their grandchildren, while at the same time locking young people out of the negotiations, locking young people out of the room and out of these conversations. And it's really great that people care about their children and grandchildren, but what about the young people who are being affected by climate change right now? Because they don't seem to care as much about the young people who are being affected by climate change today, the young people in the global south who don't have to worry about their future, who have to worry about what's happening right now as a result of the actions of developing countries and these politicians. I'm a climate activist in the UK, so a lot of my work is focused on putting pressure on the UK government specifically. And they very much tried to frame themselves as this world leader on climate in the last few weeks, in the last few years, in the lead up to Cop26. Which has been interesting to watch them try and do that while approving new fossil fuel projects left, right, and centre. But I think it's important to recognise the responsibility that the UK government has and the UK has, because they very much tried to shift that blame onto other people. The UK has a historical responsibility for causing the climate crisis. There is no way around that. That is just the truth. And so for UK politicians and UK media to be blaming the failure of COP26 on China and on India, which is a lot of the media that we've seen sort of in the outcome and following on from the outcome of COP, it's just irresponsible, and it's lying and it's manipulating reality. I think we need to be in the UK putting pressure on the lies that our politicians are telling us and the greenwashing that they're doing, because it's important to remember that these are the politicians in the UK are the ones who have a lot of the power. They're the ones who've been responsible for creating a lot of the climate crisis. And it is ridiculous for Alex Sharma and Boris Johnson to be talking about how it's China and India's fault that there's not the right language on coal in the agreement that came out of it, when they're still approving planning permissions for coal mines in the UK, when they're approving licensing for oil fields. So I think, yeah, what I'm trying to make here is that this is not where the movement ends. This is not where the movement dies. There have been 26 COPs for a reason. They don't really seem to do much. Each one, we make a little bit of progress, but we don't give up after each one. Each one, we keep gaining momentum. And now is the point to say, look, COP26 was a failure. It didn't achieve what we've been trying to achieve, but what we were trying to achieve was not going to happen in the negotiating rooms at COP26. What we're trying to achieve is going to happen on the streets through mobilization in our communities, and we need to not back down now. Now is the time to keep going, to rebuild those movements, to rebuild those links in our communities, to try and bring more people into the fight, and to recognize that this is not something that is going to be stopped overnight. It's not something that's going to be stopped in 2 weeks. And hopefully the movement only grows from here.
Sure it will. Izzy. Can I hear myself? No, that's good. Thanks a lot, Izzy. I had a couple of follow-up questions. One thing COPs certainly do is bring, in many ways, the global movement together. There were some challenges this year with the virus, accessibility, vaccines, a lot of confusion and chaos around that as well. But albeit it was an opportunity to, I was there at COP for the People's Climate Summit. It was fantastic for me to hear from a variety of voices from around the world. I'm wondering if you had a chance do the same? And perhaps if you might be able to reflect on how young people are mobilizing in other parts of the world, perhaps in the global south as well, if you've had any experience, because the political environment there is certainly very different to what we have in the UK. Is there anything you've learned, any insights you could share with us on how young people are mobilizing outside the UK?
I think young people are doing a lot of things in a lot of different countries. You've got places where young people are able to organize big strikes, but there are also places where young people aren't able to do that for various reasons. And especially sort of coming back, the sort of climate strike movement sort of slowly coming back after COVID, that's something that is an option for us in the UK. It's an option for people and young climate activists in developed countries that have access to vaccines, but it's not an option for a lot of people. And so there have been sort of more creative actions that have been taken. There have been smaller strikes, more spread out strikes, campaigns around more specific issues. And I wasn't able to get up to Glasgow, but I was in a very lucky position in London where lots of climate activists I've been working with sort of online the last few years were coming through London, and being able to take part in protests and events with them and actually build those real in-person connections was really empowering, I think, because so much of this work for the last 2 years especially has been online, but also for as long as I've been involved in climate activism, a lot of it has been done over Zoom and over WhatsApp because we're not in the same place. And so I think there is something really powerful about people being able to come together physically in the same space and share ideas and take action together. And I think that's something that is empowering and inspiring that is going to come out of COP and will hopefully lead to sort of greater connections and links and more action in the future.
Great. Thanks a lot, Izzy. Another quick follow-up is if you could perhaps identify one or two key priorities that the youth movement should focus on in the UK, what might those be? Considering what happened at COP and the outcomes from there, what are the couple of priorities for young people?
I think priorities for young people in the UK is putting pressure on the UK government to stop new fossil fuel exploration. There was a report that came out that said 40 new fossil fuel projects were being considered right now. And there is nothing in any of the science that anyone is reading about how we stop climate change that says we can cut our emissions and start approving new oil and coal and gas. That it won't work. And so that's something that we really need to be putting pressure on the government for. And I think the fact that Cop26 was in Scotland, where the Camille oil field is currently being considered, that brought a lot of attention to the fact that the UK government, despite what they're saying about being a climate leader, is still putting time and energy and money into new fossil fuel developments. And so I think that's sort of a really key thing that we need to be pressuring the government about. And that's something that can happen within the UK. It doesn't require the same level of sort of international cooperation to achieve that. That is something that is ultimately up to UK politicians. And so as a climate movement in the UK, we need to be pressuring them to act on it.
Absolutely. And it is precisely the kind of pressure that you and others have put that led to the SNP, at least Nicola Sturgeon coming out and saying she wouldn't support the Cambo oil field as well, which is great. So that's the kind of public mobilization that is clearly leading to some change, and we need to see more of that. So thanks a lot, Izzy, for doing what you're doing. I want us to move on to the final speaker, Camille Barbagallo. She is one of the organizers of the Cop26 coalition that really helped bring civil society actors, the climate movement together at COP as well. They played a key role in as I said, bring the movement together. I'm sure she has a lot of experiences in how that happened. But Camille, take it away. You've got about 4 to 6 minutes.
Thanks so much. And thanks for the invitation. Though I must confess that 10 days after 18 months worth of work doesn't feel like a very long amount of time to digest everything that we did. But it's really exciting to see people having these discussions across the movement. And I'm sure that there are going to be a lot more of them. I suppose the question of what really happened in Glasgow for, I think, a lot of people, and I think one of the contributions that and Izzy was touching on it in her contribution, was that we took a really long time to get to Glasgow. And so I think it's really important to have a think about what led up to the processes of COP26 in terms of, we saw a global day of action being organized with over 300 actions across the world. We saw 150,000 people on the streets of Glasgow during what can only be described as an act of a vengeful God and a climactic event that was truly amazing in terms of the irony of it, and over 150 actions happening across the UK. And I think that, like, I think I have a kind of slightly different analysis and kind of assessment of, I don't think that COP26 was a failure, because my brief going into COP26 was movement building. And everything that we did for 18 months was to try to build the climate justice movement, both in the UK and also to think about both the UK's historical responsibility vis-a-vis internationalism, and also to think about what internationalism looks like within a climate context, but also within a justice context. I think that we also made it really clear that we were interested in a strategy of escalation. And I think what's interesting about a strategy of escalation is that it doesn't end with the COP process, and that it sets us up to continue to have a think about putting the COP in perspective, right? And so I think what both Nathan and Izzy have kind of drawn our attention to is the kind of limitations and the configuration of what nation-state negotiations at a multilateral level look like in the kind of death throes of neoliberal capitalism. But if we think about it from the lens of movement building, I think that we've, as Izzy was talking about, kind of moved through 2 years of really different forms of organizing. We've had to learn digital forms of organizing, and with that has come the ability, I think, in an unprecedented way, to have conversations across movements. So I wanted to kind of flag up some of the key things that I think that the coalition took seriously and that have kind of seeds in them in terms of germinating kind of new ideas across the movement. One of them was a commitment to language justice. And what that meant was the recruitment of over kind of 400 movement translators who worked on our digital program and also on our in real life program, which meant that there was a whole array of dialogues and conversations that previously haven't been able to happen at a grassroots and kind of rank and file level. I think we also took seriously the question around building a politic around work and trade unions, with both a rank and file trade union caucus that operated for 18 months, as well as a more formalized getting all the Gen Secs together to kind of rally the leadership and to try to shift the leadership together through the trade union committee. And I think we saw some really interesting contradictions starting to play out. Just before COP26, we saw one of the worst TUC policies pushed forward by the GMB that had a whole lot of bullshit in it about nuclear and gas, and a whole lot of dog whistle racist politics. At the same time, you saw workers across Scotland and in other parts of the UK, led by rank and file GMB branches, in strike action that then saw hundreds of climate justice activists join those pickets throughout COP26. And you also saw GMB strikers join the youth strikes on Friday the 5th. And they offered, along with other trade unionists of many genders and heights and shapes and sizes, and were Greta and the Fridays for Future mapper guard on 2 occasions in terms of having to deal with the media. I think some other stuff that we kind of got right and was very interesting and offers a kind of new way of trying to think about how we approach these questions as a movement, was that we set up a media centre, which is reminiscent of the 1990s. If anyone here on the call was around when we were shutting down institutions like the WTO or the World Economic Forum in the late 90s and early 2000s, media centres were a really important way of democratising and getting information out. They existed usually before social media. And I think what's been really interesting over the COP26 is we put together a daily briefing. So actually to prepare for today's talk and to walk myself through the kind of 16 days of Glasgow, I logged on to to the Cop26 YouTube channel and saw Sabrina Fernandez and Ian Bruce do this daily briefing each day, which was actually quite kind of incredible. And it was put together by a huge volunteer effort of something called collective coverage. Anyway, so I think that the ways in which people have started to experiment again have come about through, first of all, a change in the way that we organize together, and that's been over Zoom and meetings like this, as well as I think what Izzy was talking about, the kind of recognition of the need for us to hold physical space and to be on the streets, and what being on the streets enables and does is different than having conversations like this one, and even having conversations like meetings. And so I think, I come from a tradition that's often quite skeptical about marches from A to B. Often they feel like movements of containment where NGOs get to set the agenda and set the premise, and we don't ever do anything wrong, and the police kind of escort us. And so what it felt for me, though, was that after the pandemic, the street has yet again become a quite contested space. The policing in Glasgow was some of the most over-the-top, outrageous neo-colonial bullshit I've seen in a while. At certain demonstrations, there was one police officer for every protester. And there was a definite chill in the air in terms of the way that the current government, with the Kill the Bill legislation and a whole variety of ramping up of racism around borders is playing out on people's ability to dissent. But the Global Day of Action had an incredible sense of what it would mean, the messiness and the kind of the contradictions that are at play when we actually try to bring climate justice out onto the streets. And that is one of the opportunities that a space like COP offers, is that there's not many spaces in the world where Indigenous leaders and farmers and peasants and workers from the global South and folk who are resisting white supremacy in the US, let alone African climate justice leaders and a whole variety of different people come together in one spot. And so in that sense, I think that we've got to be a bit more gangster, and we've got to use COP in a way that works for us, right? And we've got to go in and get shit. We've got to make sure that we have the least worst outcome, which I think is the most important red line for us to hold in the inside negotiations. And then we have to follow up on what we've done consistently, which I think it's interesting to think about repetitions, right? And so red lines is something that's continued to be repeated. And I wonder what red lines looks like outside of the context of the COP. And so in terms of strategies going forward, I think it's a strategy of escalation. I think we have to definitely get away with the TikTok, the world is ending kind of stuff. And I think the coalition did that really well. I think the framing around injustice being over and the necessity to center an intersectional understanding of justice was done well and needs to be continued and deepened. And I think that the regional and local organizing that the coalition took seriously needs to reshape the British left. We saw over 100 mobilisations in the UK, and we need to not go back to London-centric national demonstrations when we pull out of this burnout. So over and out, back to you.
Super. There was a tour de force, as I say. There was a lot packed in there, Camille. Yeah, to be honest, I don't know where to start with some of my questions, but I looked to the chat. You sort of inadvertently perhaps answered one question from Gail on positives from the COP around movement building, forms of organizing, things like that, which is fantastic to hear. Could you maybe speak a bit more around the intersectionality aspect? I mean, you spoke of language justice, two words put together that I hadn't heard of before, to be honest with you, which is great, and how you've described it makes a lot of sense. That's always been a gap in terms of being able to communicate across cultures, across languages. Having those translators is a fantastic thing that you guys have put together. You've spoken about unions, you've spoken about migrant justice, and a lot of this sort of was coming together, in fact, at COP. But I suppose the question is, whilst the movement might be speaking to itself with this language, how much of it is resonating elsewhere? One way of doing that is perhaps just a poll on this audience and see how this resonates with them. But I'll park that for now. But yeah, I'm just curious how you think that is playing out elsewhere outside these this forum, because you did say that this needs to have a knock-on effect on the broader British left, but that isn't going to happen overnight. So I'm asking a very broad question. I appreciate that, but if you can perhaps reflect a bit more on what you achieved at COP in terms of organizing and bringing these intersectional aspects together, how might that resonate outside of that bubble?
Yeah, so I don't think it's that bubbly anymore, to tell you the truth, the question around climate justice. So you mentioned the great statistic that we're at about like 80% of people are on our side. So in many ways, for the left, we have to get used to being in a majority position as opposed to being in a minority position, which is a gear change for us, I would say. And so it's about what we want to do with all this awareness that we've been raising for the last kind of 15 to 20 years, I would say, in the global north. And so I think in that way, I wouldn't think of it in the normal way of that we're just speaking to ourselves in a kind of ghettoized and jargonistic in that kind of sense. I think that I would never, normally the question around intersectionality feels like a really theoretical one. But when you have to build a demonstration and you have to go out to various different sectors and constituencies and have a conversation with them about what they're currently struggling about and how there might be connections through an ecological framing or through a systemic understanding of the battles that they're facing, I think we start to stitch together the kinds of infrastructures and frameworks that are capable of meeting the challenge that we have, because we don't really just obviously we don't just face a climactic or ecological crisis. There are a whole variety of different crises that we saw playing out over the last 2 years in the lead up to Cop26, not least obviously vaccine apartheid, the pandemic, and the kind of global revolt against white supremacy. But I think that, so in terms of, I think that there's two really interesting spaces that I think we can push on. And that is if we acknowledged the various different dead ends that haven't been particularly useful for us up until this point in terms of trying to massify a radical politics within the climate movement and trying to draw deeper and more meaningful links and connections with other social movements that are necessary when we start to think about the kind of system that we're up against. And one of them is that an ecology without people, so the kind of, not to bash everyone's favorite grandpa, but the kind of politics that David Attenborough has become a pin-up boy for, where we see polar bears that have now morphed amazingly in Glasgow into these pro-nuclear polar bears. But we see polar bears and animals, and we don't ever see people. And we see that a lot from the COP unit, that we've been here to save nature, really is a dead end, right? But the other side, which is an ecology without nature, is similarly a dead end, right? In terms of an understanding that only humans are involved in this story, and also that we can continue to maintain a kind of fiction of a separation of people from the more than human world. So I think that the kinds of spaces when we build a climate justice movement and we kind of think about both of those kind of dead ends that have been forcibly resisted by folks in the global south for a really, really long time, then we can start to see what some of the gains are that we can make in the UK at a level of movements. I think that going forward, the work within the trade union movements needs to continue and deepen massively and become a lot more complex and messy. And I also think we need to return to site battles. And I think that we need to maintain our confidence in being the majority. So that means that we have to regularly and with ever increasing intensity call everyone out onto the streets. We can't get into a trap of thinking that only direct action is the only way. And at the same time, we can't wait for mass movements to just win over the hearts and minds of fossil fuel corporations and those that they pay to be in government. And so in that way, I think that it's pretty obvious it's the same kind of strategy that has actually been around for a really long time, which is, but often we're not in the majority. So we need to maintain an active, large presence on the streets. And at the same time, we need to start getting really serious about what civil disobedience looks like at the face of the climate apocalypse. And I would gently suggest that that needs also a strategy of escalation, thinking about site battles, both here in the UK in terms of fossil fuel industries and blockading and civil disobedience in a mass way, and also in lending support to those that are on the front line. For instance, things like we all have a stake in the Amazon being protected and defended. And there are many people that need our support in various different regions as they fight against pretty catastrophic kind of governmental decisions. So over and out.
Cool. Thanks a lot, Camille. Very clear. I suppose you already answered the final question I had, but perhaps I'll ask the same question to Izzy and Nathan to conclude the event. And I just have to make one final plug for NEF right at the end before we end the call. The question, I suppose, is, as Camille was saying, the word escalation comes up. A parallel word in the negotiations was ratcheting up, basically. So what we have an agreement on, at least, is come COP27, 28, 29, what have you, that there will be a commitment to raise ambition progressively at every COP. And that gives an opportunity for the movement to also escalate and ratchet up its actions. Camille touched upon it a fair bit. I'm curious if Nathan and Izzy, in that order, if you could speak of what that opportunity perhaps could be used by the movement moving forward. Nathan, you want to go first?
Sure. Big question for like 2 minutes. I mean, look, I think what we have to do is realize that actually our governments want to look like they care about climate change. That explains all of the greenwash and the media fanfare. But they want to do that in a way that maintains the global order as it is, the global inequality that keeps them rich. So their plan is one that hurts the global majority and ignores their historical responsibility and shores up and masks the fact that they want to continue to pollute. And they have plans to do that even more. So of course, our opportunity is to fight them on all of those fronts, to actually go out to the sites, as Camille's saying, and stop them from expanding our own extractive frontier. We can also target the finance to try and stop them from financing the extractive frontier everywhere else. We can also act in solidarity, very practical solidarity with movements across the South that are doing that as well. I think as far as the UN is concerned, you can ask yourself, what is the fucking point in either developing countries or climate justice movement engaging in this when we are so consistently ignored, our issues sidelined between the states? They're bullied, threatened, divided. If they don't go along with signing their own death warrant, they're blamed. In fact, even if they go along with it, they're still blamed. I think what it comes down to for me is we can't organize a global Green New Deal in one country, right? You can't organize anything in just one country. I think these are the days where an internationalism that has been previously abandoned by the left has never been more needed. We've got to globalize that hope. We've got to globalize struggle. With the UNFCCC specifically, we can prevent worse things from happening. We have to fight on every single front. You need to organize at a global scale to achieve a just transition. Otherwise, we're going to be heading into complete chaos and an even more enforced global apartheid world. I think personally that the COP itself is going to be a moment that we're going to continue to have to contend with, a space to contest. I don't think it should be the principal focus for the majority of the movement to try and build their strategies around. I think that our strategy when it comes to the COP should sit within the context of a much broader strategy that is about building power globally, about bringing the fight to the fossil capital, about bringing the fight to empire, about decolonizing our own minds and our own movements. We've got to be serious, though, about collectively developing those strategies within our movements. We can't just rely on individual scholar activists and famous people to determine that for us. That has to be developed within the movement. And I think, ultimately it all comes down, law is made up. This is my last point. Law is made up. All of this is made up at the UN. You can have laws that are broken. That's what 26 years have shown us. You can have promises that are broken. What it all comes down to is power. So the strategy we have to get serious about is building our alternative power, as well as engaging in attempts to take state power.
Thanks, Nathan. Izzy, you've got a minute.
I think Cop26 and the media coverage around it has opened a lot of people's eyes up to what's happening. And I think now is the time to jump on that and to try and bring those people who are sort of like vaguely supportive, aware of what's happening, but not actively involved, don't necessarily know like how we solve the crisis. Now's the time to bring those people into the movement. Because yeah, like Camille was saying, we need to get more people in, and we need to be the majority. We need to make sure also though that people are coming into it and they're fighting for the right things, and they're not fighting for just the polar bears and the animals, that they're fighting for justice, and that they're aware of how climate action is going to like make their lives better and how important this is for all of us collectively. And so I think now is the time to start building this movement up even more, start bringing those people in, and using sort of climate change got its minute in the limelight because of COP. Media was talking about it constantly, and now's the time to say, okay, look, if you're frustrated by what happened with that, if you want to get involved in this, if you've never felt you had a place in this movement, now's the time to find space for all of those people. Now's the time to bring all those people in, so that when the next COP comes around, when the next big decision-making moment comes around, like we're in that much more powerful a position.
Cool. Thanks a lot, Izzy. We are out of time. I just wanted to say, if you are one of a NEF supporter on this call, a paying supporter, I just want to thank you as well, but also wanted to make a plug for the NEF supporter network. You can join the supporters network any day, anytime, right after this call, perhaps, from as little as £3 a month. This is something that really helps put together events like this, bring in excellent speakers like the ones we've got. Please do follow their work. Everyone's spoken about really escalating civil disobedience. Perhaps that's the movement we are in. That's what's needed and necessary to really tackle the climate crisis. So follow their work, join the work that they're doing, also join and support the work that NEF is trying to do as well in tackling the climate crisis, I suppose. So a final plug also for a campaign that we're running to help make Green New Deal happen in the UK, but that is focused on housing and retrofit. We're calling it the Great Homes Upgrade. So if you're interested in how do we decarbonize our homes in the UK, it's a campaign that you can come and be a part of. So please look up our website, join the supporters network, or support the campaign, the Great Homes Upgrade. So I'll conclude the call there. Appreciate it's just 1 minute past the hour. Thank you so much for joining this event. COPs will come and go, but it's the movements that we're building together that really make the difference moving forward. So join the speakers, join NEF, join the local groups that can really tackle this challenge in the UK and around the world. Thanks again, and have a good evening.